We've grown accustomed to thinking that the Vikings lived solely for battle and the clang of steel. In popular culture, they are portrayed as ruthless, fearless warriors. It seems as though they woke up with an axe in their hands and immediately set out to plunder their neighbors. But the true history of the Viking Age hides a far more pragmatic secret. It turns out that the famous Scandinavian expansion depended not on a thirst for blood, but on the weather. And right now, you'll learn why the greatest expeditions were planned with an eye toward ordinary mud and wheat. 8th century Scandinavia was a harsh land where nature forgave no mistakes. Survival here depended on a clear understanding of climatic cycles and food supplies. If you forgot to sow grain on time, no plundered golden cup would save your family from starvation. Sounds boring for fearsome conquerors, doesn't it? Yet it was precisely this strict agricultural schedule that turned them into Europe's most effective raiders. 80% of Scandinavia's population during the Viking Age consisted of ordinary farmers. These people were not professional mercenaries who trained year-round. Their main weapon in daily life was not a legendary sword, but a heavy plow. The soil in the north is rocky, cold, and requires tremendous physical effort to cultivate. Therefore, every spring, the rugged northern men went out into the fields simply to survive. No military campaign could begin until the seeds were sown in the thawed earth. The poor soils of the Scandinavian peninsula did not forgive even the slightest mistakes in planning the agricultural year. The short northern summer forced people to work from sunset to sunrise without a moment's rest. Preparing the land for sowing was incredibly hard physical labor for every member of the community. Mighty oxen and horses struggled to pull plows through a dense network of old roots. Stones had to be removed by hand to make room for sowing the precious grain. Only after completing this grueling work could the men catch their breath, even for a moment. You can't abandon the farm in April and sail off to England. If you do, by winter, your family will simply starve to death in a snow-covered hut. This is the harsh math of northern survival, which even the most ambitious jarls had to reckon with. Modern logisticians would call this a strict adherence to supply chains. The Vikings simply called it common sense. First, you sow barley, and only then do you go off to chop off the heads of foreign kings. Local chieftains understood this unbreakable dependence on natural cycles and the weather perfectly well. No sane konung would gather a druzhina in the middle of spring plowing. Any attempt to pull people away from the plow would inevitably lead to a mass revolt among the villagers. A hungry warrior loses all motivation to fight for the sake of illusory riches on foreign shores. A strong and well-fed home front has always been the foundation of any successful military enterprise. That is why even the great sea kings patiently waited for the completion of all necessary fieldwork. May and early June became that very golden window of opportunity. The sowing campaign was successfully completed, and the harvest was slowly ripening under the meager northern sun. The men in the village suddenly found themselves with a couple of free months before the autumn harvest. What is a healthy, strong farmer to do while his wheat is growing? Sitting around staring at the grass was too wasteful for the economy of the time. It was at this very moment that farmers would pull their chainmail from their chests and transform into raiders. Preparations for the expedition began long before the first drakkar touched the water. Wives and children were entrusted with tending the crops and livestock. The women of Scandinavia wielded immense power, for they literally ran the economies of entire settlements during the summer. While their husbands plundered monasteries, their wives managed the slaves, defended the farms, and traded. It was an ideal system of division of labor, centuries ahead of its time. Today, we call this delegation of authority in a family business. The women who stayed at home shouldered the entire responsibility for the clan's well-being. They masterfully managed complex household accounts and strictly monitored the safety of supplies. If enemies attacked the village, Scandinavian wives took up arms alongside the men. They held the keys to all the storerooms, which symbolized high social status. The laws of that time strictly protected women's rights to manage family property. Such respect for women's labor made Viking society incredibly resilient to any crises. But let's look at the numbers to gauge the extent of their pragmatism. A typical raid on the British coast took 4 to 6 weeks. That was just enough time to cross the sea, take the spoils, and return. They had to return strictly by August or early September. Why exactly at this time? Because the harvest was beginning and every working person was worth their weight in gold. Accurate timing of the voyage was vital for a safe return home. The North Sea is notorious for its treacherous nature and sudden autumn storms. Falling behind schedule by even a couple of weeks could lead to the destruction of the entire fleet. The sailors navigated by the sun, the stars, and the flight of birds, carefully avoiding dangerous shoals. They tried to finish all their raids before the weather began to deteriorate rapidly. Discipline on such seasonal expeditions was sustained by a powerful instinct for self-preservation. The gold and silver brought back from the raids did not sit as dead weight in chests. These treasures were instantly converted into status, livestock, and new lands. A successful summer raid allowed a farmer to buy more cows or hire additional workers. It turns out that war was merely an unusual way to invest in agriculture. You plunder Paris not just for fun, but to buy the best plow in your valley. It sounds cynical, but in the context of medieval Scandinavia, it was brilliant. Slaves brought from across the sea became the main labor force on large Scandinavian farms. English and Frankish captives performed the heaviest and dirtiest work in the fields. This freed up even more time for the locals to train and prepare for their next raids. Foreign coins were often melted down into massive bracelets for easy storage and constant wear. Such jewelry served as a kind of bank account from which a piece could be chipped off to pay for goods. This entire complex economic system revolved exclusively around the basic survival of the community. Anglo-Saxon chronicles often describe the Vikings as a sudden divine punishment. They write that the Northerners appeared out of nowhere and destroyed everything in their path. But for the Scandinavians themselves, it was a carefully planned seasonal expedition. They knew the wind directions, the currents, and the exact time to set sail. Monks in monasteries prayed for salvation, unaware of the rhythm of their enemies' lives. And the enemies simply consulted the lunar calendar and the agricultural work schedule. Weapons and armor were also incredibly expensive in those days. A standard sword could cost as much as a whole herd of good cows. A farmer could not afford to lose such equipment in a senseless winter adventure. In the summer, the sea was calmer, and the risk of going down with the expensive iron was reduced. The logic here is absolutely clear: minimizing risks while maximizing potential profit. Modern corporations operate on exactly the same principle. Interestingly, the boats themselves also required constant maintenance. In winter, the wooden hulls suffered from ice, dampness, and constant temperature fluctuations. Therefore, the drakkers were hauled ashore, repaired, and coated with a layer of resin. No one in their right mind would launch an unprepared ship into the icy waves of the North Sea. It would be like driving into a blizzard in a sports car with summer tires. The Vikings were fierce warriors, but they certainly weren't idiots. Thus, the legendary fury of the Northerners had a clear time frame. It was scheduled rage that kicked in precisely between sowing and harvesting. The whole world trembled before them while they were simply making effective use of their vacation. And this system worked flawlessly for nearly 300 years. And Europe paid them in silver, and they returned home to mow hay. Winter in Scandinavia is not just a cold season. It is a merciless period when nature literally locks you in your home. Temperatures drop so low that the seawater in the fjords freezes solid. Daylight is reduced to just a few hours, leaving people in almost constant darkness. Planning military operations under such conditions is pure suicide. Even if you assemble an army, it will simply freeze to death halfway to the ships. Modern tourists marvel at the beauty of Norway's snow-covered landscapes, but for an 8th century person, that snow meant a logistical nightmare. It was physically impossible for large units to move overland because of the snowdrifts. No supply wagon could make it through the snow-choked mountain passes. Army supply is the foundation of any war, and in winter, it came to a complete halt. Let's take a look at the diet of an ordinary warrior during a naval campaign. They mainly ate jerky, dried fish, and hard bread. In the summer, these supplies could be replenished by raiding the enemy's coastal villages. But in the winter, the enemy's fields were empty, and livestock was hidden deep inside barns and stables. If they landed on enemy shores in December, the Vikings would simply have died of starvation. Nature protected Europe from raids better than any stone walls. Now imagine yourself on the open deck of a drakkar in February. These ships had no enclosed cabins, only a light awning to shield against the rain. The icy wind cuts to the bone, and the salty spray freezes instantly on your clothes. Modern sailors in high-tech jackets can barely endure such conditions. The Vikings had only wool, leather, and incredible willpower, but even their iron-hard bodies had limits in the fight against hypothermia. The Romans also avoided fighting in winter, preferring to hole up in fortified camps. But at least the Romans had a developed infrastructure, warm cloaks, and grain reserves. The Northerners depended on mobility, speed, and the element of surprise. What kind of surprise can there be if your ship is stuck in coastal ice? In such conditions, you become a perfect stationary target for enemy archers. That is why ships were safely hidden in boathouses until the first warmth of spring arrived. Winter was a time not for destruction, but for creation and planning. On long, dark evenings, the men would gather in the longhouses around the hearth. It was there, to the crackling of burning logs, that the routes for future expeditions were mapped out. The Jarls discussed which monastery to raid and how many men would be needed for the task. These were, in a sense, medieval boards of directors approving a business plan for the summer. At the same time, the blacksmiths worked at the limits of their capacity. Swords needed sharpening, chainmail needed mending, and axes needed new handles. The winter smithy turned into a veritable production line of the northern world. The clang of hammers on anvils did not cease, even during the fiercest blizzards. Every warrior understood. His life the following summer depended on the quality of his equipment. Summer victories were literally forged during the long winter nights. Another important winter activity was the weaving of sails. It took months of continuous work by the women to create a single sail for a drakkar. Coarse wool was used, which had to be spun, woven, and impregnated with fat. Without a sturdy sail, even the fastest ship became a useless piece of wood. It was a massive investment of labor, time, and scarce materials. It's amazing how much their society depended on seasonal synchronization. Every person in the settlement knew their role and their time to work. A miscalculation meant the ship wouldn't set sail or the family would be left without bread. Today, we rely on reminders in our smartphones and electronic calendars. The Vikings read the weather by the stars, the behavior of birds, and the thickness of the ice. Their connection to nature was pragmatic, harsh, and absolutely essential for survival. Ultimately, the winter period can be described as a time of accumulating kinetic energy. Scandinavia coiled like a steel spring, gathering strength in the darkness and cold. People recovered, repaired their tools, shared stories, and prepared for the leap. As soon as the ice broke up, this spring would snap back with incredible destructive force, and then the rest of Europe would look toward the horizon in terror. To swing a heavy axe for several hours straight requires incredible endurance. We're used to thinking that Vikings trained in special military camps, but in reality, their main gym was an ordinary field and a wild forest. Chopping down trees, building houses, and constantly hauling heavy stones built phenomenal musculature. Modern fitness trainers call this functional training and charge a fortune for it. Northern farmers did this completely for free and every day from early childhood. Let's assess the actual physical exertion of an ordinary farmer in those harsh times. Plowing the rocky northern soil with a heavy wooden plow fitted with an iron tip required Herculean effort. You literally wrestle with the earth, constantly holding the plow and guiding the stubborn oxen. This develops the muscles of the torso, back, and forearms better than any modern intensive exercise regimen. By the age of 20, such a peasant possessed a steel grip capable of easily breaking a man's arm. That is why, in brutal close combat, they seemed like truly invincible monsters to their enemies. Gathering firewood for the long winter was another mandatory ordeal for every man. They had to fell huge pine trees with ordinary iron axes without the aid of convenient modern saws. Then the heavy logs had to be hauled out of the forest thicket on their own shoulders. Such routine work required tremendous leg strength and perfect coordination of all movements. This daily labor built a dense muscular corset that provided excellent protection for the internal organs. In battle, these bulging muscles acted as natural biological armor against blunt blows. Rowers on war drakkers also regularly demonstrated feats of superhuman physical endurance. To keep a wooden ship moving steadily against the wind or in complete calm, they had to sit at the oars for hours on end. A single oar weighed several kilograms, and the set rhythm had to be maintained flawlessly. The cardiovascular system of these seafarers was perfectly adapted to enormous prolonged exertion. They quickly developed what modern sports science today calls an athlete's heart. They easily covered hundreds of nautical miles, relying solely on the strength of their broad back muscles. Handling a heavy sail on the open sea also required immense physical strength. During a sudden storm, sailors had to pull thick ropes soaked with icy water. Holding down a wayward sail in strong winds developed incredible grip strength and upper body power. The entire crew had to work in perfect sync to keep the ship from capsizing in the massive waves. This constant battle against the elements brought people together and made their movements as precise as possible. On land, this teamwork helped them reposition instantly during battle. And the most interesting thing here is that this immense strength was entirely natural. No protein supplements, no chemical steroids, and no sports doctors with fancy sensors. Their daily diet consisted of sea fish, meat, fermented dairy products, and coarse grains. Skyr, a traditional Icelandic thick yogurt, was their main source of pure protein for many years. In essence, it was the perfect high-protein diet for rapidly building lean muscle mass. Modern bodybuilders pay for such diets, but the Vikings ate this simply out of historical necessity. Dried cod became a true superfood for northern seafarers in the early Middle Ages. It could be stored for months and provided warriors with a massive energy boost on long expeditions. The abundance of fatty fish supplied their bodies with a huge amount of beneficial omega-3 fatty acids. These substances supported the health of their joints, which endured terrible strain every single day. Thanks to this diet, the Scandinavians rarely suffered from ligament inflammation or brittle bones. Healthy joints allowed them to perform lightning-fast maneuvers with heavy weapons even in their later years. The Roman legions once spent long months on artificial drills for their young recruits. They forced soldiers to dig deep trenches and march to artificially build endurance. The Scandinavians didn't need to invent anything at all, because their lives already consisted of hard labor. A farmer capable of single-handedly pulling a cow out of a sticky bog was already fully prepared for war. They simply placed a large shield in his strong hands and showed him which way to strike. And this simple peasant marched forward with incredible confidence in his own strength. Weapons, too, were perfectly tailored to the familiar daily biomechanics of these simple people. A Viking battle axe did not differ all that much in balance from a woodcutter's work axe. The motor skills of a powerful strike, honed over years on pine trunks, transferred perfectly to the battlefield. In the heat of battle, a man simply did what he knew best from his long life. Only now, instead of stubborn wood, ranks of Anglo-Saxon militiamen stood solidly before him. This was a frighteningly pragmatic approach to the art of war, one that required absolutely no lengthy retraining. The Scandinavians' main tactic was the famous shield wall, which required special physical conditioning. Holding a heavy wooden shield at arm's length for a long time was excruciatingly difficult. Enemy blows rained down constantly on this barrier, causing intense pain in the shoulder joints. Only people with iron willpower and strong backs could maintain such a tight military formation. If a single person could not withstand the strain and lowered their shield, the entire row would be instantly destroyed. Therefore, the endurance of each individual farmer became the key to the survival of the entire fighting unit. On top of all this, the harsh climate toughened their immune systems to the absolute limit. The harsh life in cold, drafty homes swept away the weak, even in infancy. Only those children who possessed strong genetic resistance to infections and hypothermia survived. That is why, on long campaigns, Viking armies suffered from mass epidemics far less often than their opponents, while French knights were dying by the thousands from dysentery and filthy camps. The Northerners felt perfectly fine. Their bodies easily coped with the unsanitary conditions of foreign lands without any fancy medicines. A strong immune system helped the Scandinavian raiders recover incredibly quickly from severe injuries. Where an ordinary pampered European would die from blood poisoning, a Viking would simply bandage the wound and move on. Their bodies were accustomed to constant minor injuries, deep cuts, and severe bruises from early childhood. Thick blood, rich in platelets due to a high-protein diet, quickly stopped dangerous bleeding. Healers used simple moss and boiled medicinal herbs to treat wounds, relying on the power of nature. And this primal life force constantly saved warriors from certain death. The psychological resilience of these strong people was also shaped by the most unpredictable and harsh nature. When you genuinely risk dying of starvation every year due to crop failure, the fear of death becomes somewhat dulled. They sincerely believed in the powerful Norns, who had already woven the invisible thread of their fate to its very end. Why panic at the sight of an enemy's sword, if the day of your death has long been predetermined by the gods? This profound fatalism made them incredibly calm and cool-headed in the very center of a bloody meat grinder. It was the perfect mental armor, one that simply could not be pierced by any verbal threats. Modern licensed psychologists would call this state a radical acceptance of the inevitable. The Vikings seriously believed that any cowardice was a waste of precious time. To die with a weapon in one's strong hands was not merely honorable, it was considered the only correct way out. This philosophy of life created an ideal army that never panicked at the sight of superior enemy forces. If there are more of us, then we'll simply take their gold and return home to our beloved wives. If there are more of them, Then tonight, we'll be drinking ale in the bright halls of Valhalla. The combination of natural peasant physical strength and deep religious fatalism was truly explosive. It quickly transformed ordinary, sturdy young men from a forgotten village into the elite shock troops of the early Middle Ages. They arrived on enemy shores in the summer, full of strength, fresh, and motivated to achieve a quick victory. Their opponents were often severely exhausted by long internal conflicts and endless, grueling, feudal wars. The clash of these two worlds always ended just as disastrously for those who couldn't take the blow. Imagine you have to cross the open ocean without a compass or satellite navigation. You have only a wooden boat, a piece of cloth, and the stars above your head. It sounds like the premise for a survival movie, but for the Vikings, it was just routine. The summer sea provided them with ideal conditions for such risky voyages. It was in the summer that the winds in the North Atlantic became predictable and relatively stable. This allowed them to chart precise routes, relying on centuries of experience. The main navigation tool of the Norse was the so-called sunstone. This unique crystal allowed them to determine the sun's position even in thick fog. It polarized light, showing sailors the exact course in conditions of poor visibility. For a long time, scientists considered this a beautiful legend from ancient Scandinavian sagas. But archaeological findings have confirmed that ancient seafarers did indeed use optics. It was a brilliant engineering solution that predated the advent of magnetic compasses by several centuries. In addition, the Vikings knew how to read the ocean like an open book. They noticed changes in the color of the water, which indicated the proximity of land or shallow waters. The flight of seabirds was more reliable to them than any modern radar. If seagulls were flying in a certain direction, it meant that a shore or island was there. They even took ravens with them, which they released at sea for reconnaissance. The bird would soar upward, spot land, and fly toward it, guiding the drakkar. The summer months also meant the longest daylight hours. In northern latitudes, the sun barely sets in the summer, creating white nights. This was a massive advantage for a fleet that needed to move around the clock. The absence of pitch darkness reduced the risk of running aground on reefs or losing sight of the ships. The drakkars could sail in close formation, maintaining visual contact throughout the journey. The ship's design itself was another technological marvel of the era. The drakkar had an incredibly shallow draft, allowing it to navigate even shallow rivers. This feature made the Viking army frighteningly mobile and unpredictable. They could land not only on the coast, but also venture deep into the continent. Paris was sacked precisely because the northern ships easily sailed up the Seine. European galleys with deep drafts were physically incapable of such maneuvers. The hull of a Scandinavian boat was not rigidly nailed into a monolithic structure. The planks were overlapped and bound together with flexible twine or leather straps. Thanks to this, the ship literally flexed on the waves, absorbing the destructive force of the ocean. Instead of resisting the elements, the drakkar adapted to them, gliding across the water like a snake. Modern engineers use similar principles of flexibility when constructing skyscrapers in earthquake-prone areas. Ancient craftsmen simply intuitively understood the physics of materials without any formulas or blueprints. The speed of these ships also amazed their contemporaries. With a favorable wind, a drakkar could reach speeds of up to 15 knots. This is faster than many sailing ships of the Age of Discovery, built centuries later. The rapid deployment of troops is the foundation of a successful offensive operation in any war. The Vikings would appear at the city walls before messengers could warn the garrison. But this raises a logical question about the supply of fresh water during the voyage. It is impossible to fit huge barrels of supplies onto a small, open boat. Summer rains on the open sea solved this problem almost perfectly. Sailors stretched out leather tarps, collecting rainwater right as they sailed. Plus, quick trips between islands allowed them to frequently replenish their supplies from streams. Everything was calculated down to the smallest detail so that the weight of the cargo wouldn't slow the ship down. Navigating the narrow fjords required special skill from the helmsman. A single wrong move with the heavy rudder oar could smash the boat against the rocks. An experienced captain was worth a dozen of the best warriors and was held in the highest regard. His knowledge was passed down by word of mouth from father to son as the greatest treasure. It was a closed caste of professionals who held the keys to the world's trade routes. Thus, the summer sea was not an obstacle, but a high-speed highway. It connected Scandinavia with the richest markets and monasteries of Europe. The Vikings were not afraid of the ocean. They considered it an extension of their home. And while the rest of the world was building stone walls, the Northerners were building perfect ships. This technological asymmetry ensured their dominance for several long centuries. Viking raids are often portrayed as chaotic outbursts of uncontrolled violence. In reality, they were well-planned commercial ventures with clear profit-sharing arrangements. Every participant in the raid knew exactly what they would receive in the end. This closely resembles the modern profit-sharing model in startups. The Jarl acted as an investor, providing the ship and basic supplies. And the ordinary warriors were shareholders, risking their lives for generous dividends. Before setting sail, the entire crew would gather on the shore to make a verbal agreement. No one took up the heavy oars without a clear understanding of their financial prospects. The warriors swore on their weapons to abide by the rules for dividing the future spoils of war. Any attempt to secretly pocket a gold coin or a piece of silver was strictly punished by expulsion from the crew. This harsh punishment was called a loss of honor, which for a free Viking was far worse than physical death. The transparency of the deal guaranteed perfect discipline during the dangerous sea voyage. The spoils themselves were never divided randomly or by the right of the strongest in a drunken brawl. There were strict, unwritten laws that regulated in detail the process of dividing the plundered property. The ship's captain and the leader of the expedition always received the largest and best share. The helmsman had a legal right to a double share, as the lives of the entire crew depended on his rare skills. The remaining wealth was fairly distributed among the rank-and-file fighters after a thorough appraisal of each item. No glaring injustice was allowed to avoid bloody conflicts on the cramped deck. Interestingly, the coins themselves had no face value for them. The Vikings valued money solely by the weight and purity of the precious metal. Arab dirhams, English pennies, and Frankish denarii were simply chopped into pieces. These pieces of chopped-up silver were used as a universal currency throughout Scandinavia. Every merchant and warrior carried small folding scales on their wide belt. Business is business, and no one wanted to be cheated when paying for good ale. Foreign coins bearing the portraits of foreign rulers did not inspire any sacred awe in the Norse. To them, it was simply a shiny piece of soft metal that could be melted down if necessary. To check the quality of the silver, distrustful warriors often tested the coins with their teeth or made deep notches with a sharp knife. Skillful counterfeits existed even in those dark times, so basic caution was not out of place. If the metal proved pure enough, it was boldly sent to the communal cauldron for remelting. These heavy ingots were later fashioned into massive neck rings and thick wrist bracelets. But the main source of wealth was not even silver, but living people. The slave trade constituted a huge part of the shadow economy of the harsh Viking era. thousands of captured, terrified prisoners were sold at major slave markets from Dublin to Constantinople. It sounds cruel and horrific, but for that brutal time, it was standard commercial practice. A good, strong slave was incredibly expensive and often covered the costs of the entire summer campaign. It was this free labor that helped the Scandinavians cultivate their poor, rocky lands. The Scandinavian raiders very quickly learned to sort their captives efficiently right at the scene of the capture. Young, strong men were immediately shackled in heavy chains for grueling work in the fields. Beautiful young women were sent to the wealthy markets of the Far East, where they were generously paid for in Arab silver. But noble dignitaries and wealthy priests were guarded like the apple of their eye in separate quarters. Killing such a politically important hostage was economically unprofitable and simply incredibly foolish. For their safe return, one could easily receive a fortune without any extra physical effort. Often, the Vikings did not even attempt to destroy old monasteries or burn large cities to the ground. It was far more profitable to capture important people and demand a substantial ransom for them. Local kings and bishops gritted their teeth in frustration, but dutifully paid huge chests of gold. This is a classic racketeering scheme, which modern organized crime adopted much later. The Franks once paid 7,000 pounds of silver simply to get the Vikings to leave besieged Paris. This colossal historical sum saved the city from complete destruction and enriched an entire army of pagans. This effective form of large-scale extortion became officially known in history as the Danish money. Weak European rulers regularly paid this humiliating tax for the right to live in peace. Sometimes the tax was collected from the entire population of a country to buy off yet another massive fleet of northern invaders. The Vikings gladly accepted the tribute, sailed home, and returned a year later for another portion of silver. It was an absolutely ideal renewable source of income, requiring almost no unnecessary combat losses. Why risk your life in a bloody battle when a frightened enemy brings you its finest treasures of its own accord? The summer raiding season was also a time of grand trade fairs in Scandinavia itself. Returning with rich spoils, the warriors immediately set off for major centers such as Hedeby or the famous Birka. There, the looted silver was quickly exchanged for high-quality Frankish steel, Eastern silk, rare spices, and fine wine. The economy of the North received a massive financial injection from outside every late autumn after the end of the sailing season. This vast influx of money stimulated the rapid development of local crafts and the large-scale construction of new port cities. Small northern settlements rapidly transformed into bustling international trade hubs. In essence, constant raids were the only viable way to overcome the economic isolation of the cold region. Scandinavia had absolutely no rich gold deposits of its own or vast fertile plains for agriculture. Their only liquid export commodities were furs, walrus ivory, and murky Baltic amber. This was critically insufficient to sustain the high standard of living of the ambitious local chieftains and kings. Therefore, they cynically decided to export fear and violence, actively importing the material wealth of others. It was a brutal macroeconomy, written in blood on the ancient pages of European monastic chronicles. The risks in such a dangerous business were truly colossal, but the returns were beyond imagination. A single successful sea voyage could turn a simple, poor farmer into the richest man in the entire village. He would return to his home fjord, bathed in glory, and immediately buy up the best plots of land in the area. It was a powerful system of effective social mobility for all ambitious Scandinavian youth. You didn't have to be born a prince to become a very influential and wealthy lord. All you needed was a sharp iron axe, reckless bravery, and a place on a good war drakkar. Of course, not all young men returned alive from these dangerous summer expeditions. Insidious foreign diseases, sudden sea storms, and sharp enemy arrows took many young men away forever. But in a society where death in bloody battle guaranteed a ticket to Valhalla, the deadly risk was entirely justified. People understood perfectly well that great, swift wealth always demands great human sacrifice. The loss of the primary breadwinner was a terrible tragedy, but the community never abandoned the families of fallen heroes to their fate. The widows of fallen warriors were required to receive a fair share of the spoils from their husbands' grateful surviving comrades. This substantial share helped a single woman hire new, strong workers for her orphaned farm. Such reliable social support within the fighting band worked far better than all modern pension funds. A stern warrior went into mortal combat with a calm heart, knowing full well that his young children were financially secure. The strong bonds of male brotherhood made the crew of a single ship a unified, practically invincible, cohesive organism. This entire complex financial machine was bound to come to a complete halt by the imminent onset of the cold autumn. Ships, heavily overloaded with imported goods and frightened slaves, slowly made their way back to their native northern shores. The captains were in a great hurry to make it home before the season of destructive storms and the first night frosts began. Time was the most ruthless enemy of all, one that could not be bribed with any amount of Arabian silver. The summer business season was drawing to a close, giving way to domestic concerns. By the end of August, the Scandinavian villages were frozen in agonizing anticipation. Women and the elderly gazed intently at the gray horizon of the sea fjords. The fleet's return meant not only family reunions and boisterous feasts, it meant that the necessary labor force for the harvest had arrived in the settlement. The harvest was already ripe and had to be gathered urgently before the torrential autumn rains. A delay of even a week could result in a local humanitarian disaster. As soon as the ships touched shore, the warriors instantly switched roles. The famous conquerors of the seas and the terror of Europe set aside their blood-stained shields. They took sickles in hand and went out into the fields to cut the heavy ears of barley. Imagine an elite special forces soldier who, after a secret mission, goes to dig potatoes. For the Vikings, there was nothing humiliating or strange about this. It was the natural cycle of life, where the sword and the plow were equal tools for survival. The harvested grain had to be threshed, dried, and stored in secure granaries. In addition, it was time to slaughter the excess livestock that would not survive the winter. The meat was salted, dried in the cold wind, or smoked under the roofs of houses. This work required the physical strength of every adult man in the family. Gold from Paris won't keep you warm in January or feed your children. Full granaries and barns have always been the true treasure of the North. The autumn feasts we so often see in movies had a practical purpose. They were a way to consume perishable food and strengthen social bonds. The Jarls distributed gifts to their warriors, securing their loyalty for the coming year. Silver bracelets passed from the chieftains' hands to those of heroes who had distinguished themselves in battle. Such gestures of generosity were the best investment in the loyalty of the future army. Most of the judicial assemblies, known as tinges, also took place in the fall. Free men gathered together to resolve disputes and pass laws. While all the men were at home, it was possible to fairly settle neighbors' claims. This was a unique form of early democracy among people armed to the teeth. If you couldn't prove your case with words, you sometimes had to settle it in a duel. But most often, disputes were resolved peacefully, since spilling your neighbor's blood was not in anyone's interest. Interestingly, The captured slaves were immediately integrated into the agricultural cycle. They were assigned the heaviest and dirtiest work of preparing the farm for winter. This freed up the free Scandinavians to repair houses and gather firewood. Thus, the summer raid directly increased the efficiency of the autumn work. External expansion literally fed and heated their domestic economy. By November, the weather had finally turned bad, and the sea was closed to navigation. Storms became so fierce that any attempt to go out on the water was suicide. Ships were dragged far ashore, turned over, and covered with animal skins. The village fell into hibernation, switching to a mode of extreme calorie conservation. The circle closed, returning these people to where we began our story. The great era of expansion was put on hold until the next cry of the spring birds. European rulers often thought that their prayers had finally been answered. In the fall, the attacks ceased, and abbots praised the heavens for ridding them of demons. They did not realize that the demons had simply gone to salt fish and repair roofs. This fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy cost the Europeans dearly. While kings disbanded their armies for the winter, the Vikings were already planning new routes. This whole system worked perfectly until the climate began to change. When Europe grew warmer and the Scandinavian kingdoms united, the rules of the game changed. Professional armies emerged, no longer needing to return to haymaking. The era of free farmer raiders was slowly but surely coming to an end. They were replaced by regular troops and taxes, which killed the spirit of the old adventure. But that is a completely different story for another historical analysis. And yet, these 3 centuries forever changed the map and the gene pool of Europe. A system built on mere survival, and the changing of the seasons crushed empires. A pragmatic approach to resources proved more effective than any military doctrine of the time. The Vikings proved that victory does not go to those who want to fight the most. Victory goes to those who know how to sow grain at the right time and plan their summer vacation properly. Now, when you see a screaming berserker in a movie, you'll know the truth. This guy isn't screaming because he's possessed by the spirits of war or a thirst for blood. He's screaming because he needs to finish the raid quickly and make it back in time for haymaking. The history of the Vikings isn't a fairy tale about magic and bloodthirsty monsters emerging from the mist. It's a stunning example of how a harsh climate shapes the perfect machine of efficiency. And sometimes the greatest historical events can be explained by a simple desire to eat well in the winter.